my friends, my name is AJ. Welcome back to my book nook. Today I am going to be talking about the Time Quintet by Madeleine L'Engle. This is a set of 5 books that kind of combine some fantasy aspects, some sci-fi aspects, and it's definitely really interesting. You've probably most likely heard of the first book in the series, A Wrinkle in Time, but you might not have been aware that it was a full series. So I decided to attempt to read this entire series in a day. If you want to watch that video, I'll leave a link for you in the description. But I really enjoyed them, and I thought I would do a bit more in-depth of my opinion on it since I didn't really cover it in my previous video. First thing you should know about these books is that they were written by the American author Madeleine L'Engle. L'Engle's belief was that some things are too complicated to explain to adults, and therefore you have to explain them to children. So complex scientific ideas are difficult to understand as an adult because we have a different way of believing and a different way of thinking about things when a child is more imaginative and they're able to just accept things as they are. So that is why she decided to include some of the more complex and modern science in these fantasy books for children. She also believed that when you have something complex and important to say, that you should be doing it through fantasy. L'Engle was also a Christian, so her books blend that modern science with a little bit of religious allegory as well, in a way sort of similar to the Narnia series by C.S. Lewis. It is a bit different though. I find C.S. Lewis's inspiration from a religious background is a lot more clear and more obvious. These books, it's sort of a bit more underground. It's not as obvious that that's what the inspiration is. The age group for this book I do find can be a little bit muddy. In some places online I've seen it referred to as young adult. In some places I've seen it referred to as junior. On the back of these books it says between the ages of 10 and 14, and that can be a bit confusing. I would say that it's a young adult in nature, but more younger readers in how hard it is to read. If it's something that a younger kid wants a bit of a challenge, then this would be a good book for them because it's not too hard to understand, but it is definitely some heavier topics. If you're looking for something challenging as a young adult read, this might not be the books for it. It's definitely an easy read, it's definitely interesting, so I would say if you haven't read them that you definitely should. Alright, so that's about all the background that you should need on these books. Let's dive into my opinions on them. I will say off the bat, normally these reviews start with a non-spoiler review and then dive into some of my spoiler-filled opinions. However, I just don't really have any strong spoiler-filled opinions on these books. We'll get into that a little bit later. Alright, so the first book in the series is called A Wrinkle in Time. This follows a girl named Meg Murray, her younger brother Charles Wallace, and her new friend Kelvin as they go off on this adventure following the 3 magical strangers, Mrs. Who, Mrs. Whatsit, and Mrs. Witch, as they go on this big adventure to try and rescue her father from the darkness. I definitely really loved this book. I had read it before. I tried reading the whole series in a day, and I really enjoyed it. It's definitely very surreal. The imagery of it is very interesting. A lot of times it's described as undescribable, incomprehensible, and it's just such an amazing imagery that's portrayed through it. It's got that mix of kind of science aspects to it, but it's also got fantasy, and I think that science fiction and fantasy work really well together. The message of this book is also really lovely. The main character, Meg, she does have a lot of anger. She's very passionate, she's very outspoken, and these are typically seen as her flaws, and she's able to use those things that are seen as her flaws as her strengths. And I think that's a really great message, especially if the age group for this is kind of that middle school age where they're going through that transition zone of trying to figure out who they are and trying to push those boundaries to grow up. It's a really great message to have. It also has a lot of really great writing and wordplay in it. A lot of the characters have names that are play on words. Like we've got the happy medium, obviously the 3 strangers, Mrs. Who, Mrs. Whatsit, and Mrs. Witch. Obviously a little bit of wordplay there. It's just so well written, it's so fun. I also just really love Meg as a protagonist. She's very passionate, she's very intelligent, she's very brave. She cares a lot about her family and her friends, but she also is just, she's a flawed character, and I really like that. Also, this may not seem as important to a lot of people, but Meg has glasses, and I got my glasses when I was 13, and around that time didn't think it was a possibility, but I always kind of played with the idea of how fun it would be to like be an actor or go on these great adventures. And none of these characters that I really loved had glasses, and the only characters that I ever saw on TV or in movies or books were like the nerdy characters or the quirky best friends, and it was one thing that kind of disappointed me when I got my glasses. It was like, well, none of the characters that I love that are going on these adventures and having these big expeditions, they don't have glasses, so I could never do that. And having that character have glasses like that, but also going on this big adventure and being brave and being outspoken and adventurous, but also still very intelligent, I really, really appreciated that. And I think that if I had read this book when I was that age, I think that that would have meant a lot to me. One of the things that I didn't really like was the character of Charles Wallace. Charles Wallace is Meg's younger brother. He's 5, he's a genius, and he's very boring. He's kind of that archetype of that character who's a genius, but no one really understands him, and they don't really appreciate them until later on. I didn't find that interesting, and that will be detrimental later on in the series, and we'll get into that a bit. Also, I found that the end happened very quickly. This happened for a lot of the books, so I'm only going to bring it up now, as opposed to later bringing it up for all of them. But all of them have a rather slow start, rather long chapters at the beginning, and then the very last chapter is pretty short, and a lot happens. And you never feel like you're going to be able to finish everything in one book because you're getting to the last chapter and there's so many loose ends to tie up. And it always does get tied up at the end, but it just feels so fast that it's just a little bit worrying, and I'm not a huge fan of that. I did love A Wrinkle in Time. I think it was for sure my favorite book in the series. So if you don't feel like reading the whole series after this, I would definitely suggest reading this book. It's phenomenal, it's creative, it's unique, it's absolutely wonderful. The second book in the series is called A Wind in the Door. This once again is following Meg and Charles Wallace and Calvin, but this time it's mainly following Meg and Calvin, because Charles Wallace is having some sort of illness that is being caused by this thing called ecthroi, which are basically nothingness. And Meg and Calvin have to work with this person who is like the teacher, and they have to work together and go through these tests to try and save Charles Wallace and the world. Again, this has a really, really great message in it. It's a lot about learning to love those people who are difficult to show love to, and I think that's kind of where you kind of see that Christian message coming through as well. It's really, really good. I didn't like it as well as Wrinkle in Time, but I still really loved it. It was definitely had a lot of that wordplay again, which is really fun. They go inside a mitochondria at some point, which was very interesting. And that, along with most of the book, has just amazing imagery. A lot of the scenes take place in places where they can't see each other, but they're able to communicate through their minds and know that they're aware of each other's placement within their mind. It's definitely also very strange and surreal, just like the first book. I wasn't really a huge fan of the character of Mr. Jenkins. He's a character that Meg has to learn how to love to pass her first test, but he ends up sticking around and helping them, but he doesn't really help. He's just kind of there. If anything, he's kind of more of a burden. I don't know what the purpose of having him still there was. And also just the concept of these teachers were not really explained. We're introduced to this character who is a teacher, and they're the one giving the tests to Calvin and Meg. This teacher also tells them that their pet garden snake is also a teacher, and they don't explain that concept very much. I wish it would have been explained more. I think it's a really cool idea that there are these kind of mythical teachers who go to these people when they need them most and kind of guide them and lead them and teach them. But I wish that the idea of it had been explained a little bit more. But yeah, that's A Wind in the Door. I thought it was really, really great. It was definitely really surreal. It has a lot of the same charm as the first book, and you should definitely check it out as well. Now we get into the third book, and this is definitely the weirdest, and it is called A Swiftly Tilting Planet. So in this book, we don't focus on Meg anymore. It's over 10 years since the previous books have happened. Meg is now an adult, Charles Wallace is a teenager, and this follows Charles Wallace. You can see where my issue with Charles Wallace as a character is coming back now. Basically, what happens is their father occasionally is a consultant, because he's a physicist, for the President of the United States. And he gets a call that there is a threat of nuclear missiles being sent from a fictional South American country. Charles Wallace is given this amulet by Meg's mother-in-law, and he has to use it to travel through time with the help of a talking unicorn to basically possess the bodies of different ancestors of this country's leader. I don't know if it's president or what, they don't really refer to what his position is, and try and prevent bad things from happening, which will eventually lead to this person becoming a bad person. It's very different from the first two books. It still is a bit surreal, but the surrealist charm of the first two books kind of dissipates in this one, and it becomes more of a time travel adventure, more of experiencing these different times. There's a part where he goes to medieval Scotland. There's a part where he goes to the Salem witch trials. I didn't really find Charles Wallace to be that interesting of a character in the first place, so to have him in the front and have Meg kind of sidelined was kind of upsetting to me. And also, it's just weirdly dark. Like, the first two books definitely were, you know, let's fight the darkness, let's fight the nothingness, which is obviously a dark idea. And a lot of kids' shows have these dark concepts of, we're gonna try and save the world, but you don't really think about it that much. This one is something that's very real. Obviously, it does make sense that she said, if you want to cover heavier topics, cover it in fantasy, cover it for kids, because they'll understand it more. But it was just definitely a weird shift from the first two books. What I will say is that it was really interesting to see it through history and have it all connected. I really love books where they have current storylines and kind of past storylines, and they show how they're interweaved. And I just think it's a really interesting concept, the idea that you have to go through time and possess these bodies to, you know, change what happened. I can definitely see that being like an action movie nowadays. It's just a weird shift that I was not expecting. The fourth book in the series is called Many Waters. Again, this is a total shift from the other books as well. This one follows Meg and Charles Wallace's brothers. They're twins named Sandy and Dennis, and they get transported back in time to the time of Noah building the ark. However, it's a little bit different because there are manticores, there are griffins, there are seraphim, and there are Nephilim, which are basically fallen angels all on Earth and interacting with these humans in this oasis that they all live in. And it's definitely very different. You can obviously see the religious content much more evident in this one, obviously. They struggle a bit with knowing that the flood is going to happen because they know that there are some good people who aren't going to survive. And there is that kind of struggle of, well, if we can do something about this, shouldn't we try and save them? But then at the same time, we can't really change, you know, history. We do get a lot of depth of the other characters, which I really liked. We didn't just have these characters who they're interacting with and it's like, oh, this is Noah, this is Noah's sons and their wives, this is his daughters, blah, 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 blah. We do get to actually see the depth of these characters a bit more. We get to see the dark sides of them and the light sides of them. However, I feel like we had a little bit too much of that. The main characters in this book are obviously Sandy and Dennis, but we don't really spend a lot of time with them. So it was hard for me to connect with them much if we didn't really see them much. And it was hard to connect with the new characters because they were brand new. We also were jumping between all these different characters so much that it was hard for me to really connect with any of them or really care about any of them. Another issue I had is that the passage of time just isn't very clear. We don't really understand how long they've been there. There's one character who ends up getting married, getting pregnant, and then giving birth all in the time span of them being there. And I was a little bit annoyed by that because I didn't really understand how fast time was moving. It's definitely an interesting book. I think it's probably one of my least favorite in the series though. as it is very, very differently formatted from the others, and I just didn't find it super interesting. And then the final book in the quintet is called An Acceptable Time. This one follows Meg and Calvin's daughter, Polly, as she goes to stay with her grandparents, and her, alongside of her parents' friend, the bishop, and her friend, Zachary, end up getting transported through this time gate in their yard, which leads them to 3,000 years ago and puts them in the middle of a battle between two communities of druids. I thought this one was really interesting. I really liked it. I think I would have liked it as a standalone book, as it didn't really have any of the same characters as the first four, so it seemed a bit odd that it was connected to those ones. We get to see some real struggles being taking place in sort of this fantasy realm. So when they're in this 3,000 years ago time, Polly is struggling with her relationship with her friend Zachary. She discovers that he may not necessarily be the person that she thought he was. She discovers that he may not be as good as the person she thought he was. She begins to have feelings for someone else who's there that she'll never actually get to stay with because he lived 3,000 years ago. I really like that we had those real struggles, those real emotions that were being dealt with in a more fantasy setting. I also really like that we had these characters that weren't necessarily good or bad, and in this battle between the druids, even though she was on one side of the lake when it happened, they didn't decide that the other side was just completely evil. We meet certain members of that group who are actually quite nice. I like that the characters were complex. I like that they had depth, and I liked that they weren't just solely good or bad. Some of the things I wasn't really a fan of, going back to the second book with Why Mr. Jenkins Came Along, why did the bishop come along? He did not need to be there. He didn't really add much to the story. If anything, he wasn't even talked about much, so I don't know why he came at all. I also wasn't a huge fan of just the fact that nothing really stood out to me. As I mentioned earlier, I don't really have any strong spoiler-filled opinions about these books because I felt that that was kind of the case for most of them. The first two books definitely were really, really great, but then we end on this book, and it's fine, it's good. I think it's definitely better than the third and fourth book, but it's just not anything to write home about. And it doesn't really seem connected to the others because none of the characters are the same, and it was definitely hard to dive into a last book when I felt that I had connected to this family so much that suddenly I was talking to a completely different group of people. So what are my final thoughts? As far as sci-fi and fantasy go, it's one of the most unique stories that I've ever read. I definitely prefer the first two books, and especially the first book, over the rest of them. I think that it's really disappointing because I read the first book, was absolutely entranced by it, and couldn't wait to read the rest, and I was just a bit let down. Overall, I thought they were really good, but I just felt like they could have been better. I think it would have made more sense to focus on Meg as a protagonist because to me, she was the one I was able to connect with most. She was the one who was the most interesting and had the most character development within the first two books, so it didn't really make sense to me to switch to a character that we didn't see very much and wasn't very interesting from the first two books for the third book, and then in the fourth book choose two side characters that we know even less about. But I definitely think that there were some assets to these books that were really good. Having said that, I think that the entire series just kind of let me down as a whole. So if you don't want to go through with reading the later books in the series, I wouldn't really blame you. But I'd say definitely give A Wrinkle in Time and A Wind in the Door a chance. But I don't know if you necessarily have to read the other three. I hate saying that. I hate that this is the first video on my channel where I'm saying you don't have to read a book. Maybe you saw this and thought, hey, that sounds interesting and you'll want to pick it up, but they weren't for me. Anyways, that's it for me today. Whoop, not so fast. Sorry everyone, this is Editing AJ. I realized that I didn't give you a rating for this series when I made the video, so I'm gonna give you one now. I'm gonna give this series a 3.5 time traveling unicorns out of 5. And that's really just an average of the really great first two books and the rest that I wasn't a huge fan of. Okay, that's it. Bye. I hope you liked this video. If you did, feel free to give it a thumbs up. And if you like this kind of video, feel free to hit that subscribe button. Maybe stick around. I will be doing a review of the movie adaptation of A Wrinkle in Time very soon and seeing how accurate it is to the book. So if that's something you want to see, Stick around for that. And what about you? Have any of you read the Wrinkle in Time series? Did you have these same opinions as me, or do you disagree and you think that the rest of the books are absolutely phenomenal? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to have a conversation with you, but let's try and keep it as spoiler-free as possible so that everyone can participate in the conversation. But that's it for me today. I hope you liked this video, and I will see all of you lovely people in the next video. Bye!